Zainab?
Doing good. How are you?
I am well. It was, when I was outside for ESS, that was cold.
It's freezing.
And it started,
Temperature drop so
yeah,
low.
and it started snowing. It's like these little pellets.
Right.
And so I had to hide. I had to duck and cover. I am done. Apparently, April is done with us, but I'm done with April.
Isn't
Right?
it supposed to be warm?
Yeah. I think today is supposed to be the last cold day. Like after this, we're supposed to be in the clear. But
Better
still,
be.
I want to get out in the garden. I want to, get stuff in there. All right. So what do you think? Ways that you know to visualize data.
I don't know what that means. Visualize data?
Right.
Like,
So,
graph.
right. There we go. A graph would be one.
Diagram.
Okay. Can you be specific about what kind of diagram?
Binary trees? I don't know.
Well, that would be a data structure, right? That doesn't necessarily help visualize the data. It helps visualize the data structure. But like if you want to visualize like grades, you can use a bar graph. ManageBack uses a bar graph.
You can use a table. Columns and rows.
Good. Okay. We're gonna see a ton of different data visualizations today. So just be thinking along those lines about how you can visualize, and so the lecture will focus on that. All right. So I messaged Ayana and I messaged the whole class on Classroom. So we'll see if Anaya, Jerry, or Ayana pop in. So today's lecture, and I am recording this, so so I just want to go over the stuff. And then this week, what's due is the lecture notes and the link list, the circular link list project. So, but if you get the W link list in, then that's fine. So let's go directly to the lecture. Got lots of tabs open because there's lots of different data visualizations to show. And so this is not a Nearpod. This Google Slides is attached to this week's task. It has more to do with our modeling. So our extra little unit about modeling, that's where this comes from. And when we talk about visualizations, what we're talking about is the use of something that can be interactive. It can be a sensory representation, so you can represent with something that actually has physical texture. All right, some topographic maps are like 3D printed, or old globes actually used to have mountain ranges represented by having bumpiness on those mountain ranges, which is really cool. So you can have a variety of different sensory representations of visualization. However, most of them, especially the ones that we're concerning ourselves with, are going to be visual. They won't necessarily, be something that we can touch, but that is something to keep in mind. And what we're doing is we're taking that abstract data and we're visualizing it so that we can allow people to understand the data better. And so that's what it means by reinforcing cognition, that understanding piece. Building hypotheses off of that data by visualizing it is really powerful. And then coming to some sort of valid conclusions, that reasoning part, thinking through what the data means, is really helpful when you can visualize it, right? So here is here's some data. There are 4 different visualizations that I'm going to give you. This is the first one. And this is all data taken from 2014 through 185 million tweets. So 185 million tweets is big data. There's a lot of information in there. You can suss out data from all those tweets by taking hashtags, by taking mentions, by taking just words like word clouds, and manipulating all of that inside of a gigantic data structure, inside of a gigantic database, and then trying to come up with trends. So what we see here on this particular visualization is that on the x-axis there is time, right? So from January to December over the course of 2014. And then every different color, I believe, refers to some sort of different, it might be a hashtag, it might be a particular classification of user. It's not entirely clear exactly what each color refers to on this visualization, but you'll see that colors do have more meaning as we go through this. There are events that mark more mentions than usual, right? There's a general up and down wave here of, over the course of a week, there's more mentions on a particular day of week than any other particular day of week, which is just kind of how it goes. But then the State of the Union address that happened in late January, there was a huge peak of mentions. When Russia invades Crimea in March, then there's a peak. The Donald Sterling and Los Angeles Clippers controversy about racist remarks that he made, huge peak. Hobby Lobby decision, the downing of MH17, which was a plane, the shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, all of these things all have their own peaks. And so we can actually identify those with things that are happening, which is really cool because you can take this data and you can say, oh, what did people really talk about? For the whole year, very clear that the biggest topic, the biggest Twitter mentioned topic was the Ferguson shooting and the follow-up with the grand jury decision. So this allows us to see that the shooting itself had 2 peaks. One peak when it happened and one peak when the protest happened. And so it allows us to see, to get a better idea of how people interact online. So then there's, go ahead, say that.
Do the colors mean anything?
And that's the thing that I think, so the colors mean something here. The colors definitely mean something in that other one, except I didn't, when I cut and pasted this whole graphic, I unfortunately did not take those colors. So I don't remember exactly what they stand for, but here it makes it clear what those colors mean. So what this is a weekly share. So you can think of this like a pie chart where every fraction of every color represents a fraction of the news conversation. And every story is a different color. So all this adds up to 100% if you look vertically along this graphic. And what you see here, and it shouldn't surprise us, that in late January, when Obama in 2014 was making his State of the Union speech, that his share of the news conversation increased, all right? And it's easy to read this and think that the talking about the GOP, which is the Republican Party, also increased, but it didn't, because we're looking at this fraction, which is roughly the same here and here and here. It just gets bumped up on this visualization because it's like a stacked bar chart is essentially what this is, except it's over a linear sequence of time. So you have to look at the relative proportions on this sort of visualization. And so every topic, not many people were talking about Russia or Ukraine here, but then a whole lot of people were talking about Russia and Ukraine in March. I know it's hard to read because the text is kind of blurry. but like a lot of people were talking about Ferguson. We see that almost half of the national conversation was about Ferguson and Eric Garner in mid-August, just like it was near the end of the year. A lot of people were talking about Ebola. There was an Ebola outbreak in October, and a whole lot of the world was talking about that. But only, like a smaller fraction was talking about Ebola here, and then nobody was talking about Ebola for the rest of the year. So this helps us to see story by story the relative percentage of people who are talking about something. It's the same data, it's just enabling us to see it in a different way. This is slightly different data, or it's a different subset of the same data. So this is taking all those Twitter mentions and saying, okay, because most of these topics are political, then let's look at it through these political lenses. So let's look at it through the lens of political insiders. What were political insiders saying? So these would be people who are identified as your talking heads on all sorts of cable news, people who came from the government or are currently in the government, and so have a lot of inside information from either their experience or or their jobs. And so looking at these people, you see that what they're talking about during a particular week is slightly different than what all of Twitter is talking about. And they don't talk about Donald Sterling or the Los Angeles Clippers because political insiders are much less concerned about basketball and much more concerned about elections. They were talking about the midterm elections, and they were talking about the controversy about Benghazi. They didn't mention, I mean, according to this, it wasn't the most talked about story for any particular week. Doesn't mean they weren't talking about it at all. It just means that it wasn't the most talked about story, according to what this is saying here. And then it splits it up between self-identified conservative activists and self-identified liberal activists in order to be able to suss out, hey, what's important in the conservative world and what's important in the liberal world? Well, guns dominates a lot of the conversation for much of March and April, whereas Obamacare dominates much of the conversation during that same time. We see that there's a lot of crossover, and we see that here conservatives were talking about Ebola much more than liberals were talking about Ebola. Again, it helps us to form some sort of conclusions, make some hypotheses, and investigate a little bit further. But having the data visualized like this helps to make sense out of enormous data sets that otherwise we would just be looking at for hours and hours and hours and not be able to make sense of. The last visualization here is the most talked about stories by audience for the entire year. And so there we see it's kind of like a top 10 list for all of Twitter, for political insiders, conservative activists, and liberal activists. So this gives us some window into what different kinds of people are talking about. And then particular politicians by audience member, by type of audience. And this is more summative. So this is, there's no axis of time on this one, it's just frequency. And again, this helps us to come to some sort of meta conclusions about the data. I don't want you looking at this from the perspective of, hey, it's really important for us to understand the political world, or these are the 4 visualizations that we should always look to make. I want you to look at this from the perspective of, hey, there's a lot of different ways to visualize big data. And there's lots of different ways to separate it out into meaningful categories. We can look at it over time. We can look at it more summatively, like big picture. We can look at things as parts of a whole, the whole pie chart concept, but pie chart spread over time. There are as many ways to visualize data as there are sets of data. So I don't want you to think that I'm trying to narrow you into any particular ways to visualize or analyze data. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So on this next slide, I have a ton of examples. So I've already called up these examples so we can look at them real quick. And I'd like you to give me as much feedback as you would like to, so that, because I've seen them before, but this is maybe the first time that you're seeing them. These are all really cool visualizations. And so we can go through how this was created. There's a variety of different software packages that can be used to create visualizations. There is an entire Python library that can help us to make visualizations that I want to play around with before I roll out to you guys, because I do want you to have some experience with making some sort of visualizations of data, and I want to make it as easy as possible so that you're not stuck, you're not bogged down by the coding, but you're feeling like you're able to create something new. So what we see here is this is a visualization of the New York's City Bike program, which is a shared bike program, to see how people actually rode for 1 month. And the circles represent the number of available bikes at each station. Now you can come to your own conclusion about what available bikes at each station means. A lot of availability may mean that that's a really unpopular place to ride from or to. A lot of availability may also be that City Bike is trying to make sure that there's lots of bikes there because lots of people like to bike from that particular location. But here's what we see as we move through, and this is over the course of a few days, right? That's why it's getting dark and light. And so I think what's interesting is that at night, in the north of Manhattan, right, there are fewer bikes, but then during the day, that changes to central and southern Manhattan. And so it shifts over the course of the day. And especially look at central Manhattan, this main corridor of travel has a whole lot at midday when people presumably are parking their bikes because they've already commuted to work. But it was also rainy, so that could mean something as well. There are so many dimensions to this data. It's telling us the temperature, it's giving us the weather, we've got the time, we've got the day of the week. All of those things influence whether or not people are going to be biking and where they are biking. So a really cool visualization of the data. And this can help government officials make policies about maybe where they should put bike lanes. This could help the company itself figure out where they need to redistribute bikes over the course of the day. Because that's what they do, is they'll take bikes from certain bike stations and maybe move them to other bike stations. These visualizations aren't just good because they're fun to play around with, but they can also be used by industries, by corporations. Yeah, there's a ton that you could conclude for this. All right, second one is, this is a listicle, an article that is a list. And these are examples of different data visualizations from history. So if you're a history geek, this is something to examine because it's just really fun, because then you get to see history through the lens of data and kind of get a better picture for what happened historically. And these were data visualizations that were put together contemporaneously, meaning this wasn't put together like now. This wasn't from the last 10 years. This is put together at the time itself by historians in order to best visualize what was happening. And on this one, what this says is a graphical table of the temperature in degrees from 0. So the Raymer's thermometer is a Celsius thermometer, was a Celsius thermometer. So what it's showing is how ridiculously cold it got during Napoleon's march on Russia. And essentially, what this is showing is how many troops he had, and that he ended up with coming back, returning with just 10,000 troops after starting with 470,000. So this is the trip out, and this is the trip back. Basically, they all died, and a lot of them deserted because of the temperatures. But this shows it in a very interesting way. This is a pretty famous visualization. This is one of the first times that data visualization was actually used in order to drive public policy. And obviously it's very relevant to what we're seeing today. So in 1854, there was an outbreak of cholera in, I believe, is this London? Yeah, okay, whew, got my history right. So, and what this showed for the first time was on a map where people were getting cholera. And every line on this map represents an additional cholera case. What this suggested to policymakers, because the cholera outbreak wasn't happening very far away from Broad Street, and in fact, it was all centered around this one water pump. So the government officials at the time saw this and said, wait a minute, what it seems like is that this one pump is the focus of this outbreak. And this allowed them to say, we have to do something about this one pump. So if we stop people from getting their water from this one pump, then we will stop the cholera outbreak. And that's in fact what happened. This was infected water, and people were all getting cholera from this one water supply. Because there's a pump over here, but there's very few cases in this area. And there's another pump over here, there's no cases in this area. So what ended up happening is that that well was contaminated, and they came up with a solution, and they were able to fix the problem. And this mirrors what we're dealing with now, because instead of water pumps, our issue is where people are testing positive for coronavirus, and we don't have the testing right now in order to be able to determine where those people are and who they've interacted with, because water doesn't move, water wells don't move, but people do. So there's an extra dimension of where those people have been. So there are developers right now, Apple and Microsoft and Google, who are developing apps to do what's called contact tracing in order to determine who has been where, who they have had contact with, and how we might be able to trace that back to initial cases, people who maybe haven't tested positive yet, but they might be positive because everyone has a common interaction with them. Or if you've interacted with someone who's positive, hey, you need to get tested yourself because you might have it and you might need to be hospitalized. You might have to take other precautions. You definitely should quarantine in order to make sure that we don't have continued outbreaks. So this visualization, even though it's 150 years old, is something that we are struggling to put together right now because we don't have the appropriate amount of data. Here we have causes of mortality in the Crimean War. And so what you see here is that it's kind of like a pie graph for every month. And it is arranged in a circular format so that we can see this trend happening. All right. So this is the beginning, April 1855. And then we see it decreasing over time. The black line it says black line across the red triangle in November 1854 marks the boundary of the deaths from all other causes during the month. The legend is down here, but this was made, again, contemporaneously. So we've been dealing with data visualizations for a long time. It's just that as we have computers to help us out, then we are able to do these obviously way more quickly and with more fidelity. I don't even want to get into this one. It looks as complicated as it is. Again, if you're a history buff, there is some really cool information in here just about how the Roman Empire rose and fell, and how the Roman Empire gave rise to a lot of the countries that we are now familiar with, like France, like Spain, like Turkey, like Where's another one? Iran, all right, Uzbekistan, Germany. So pretty cool from a historical perspective. This, obviously, much more contemporaneous, but using these blocks to visualize outlays of a budget is something that is used very commonly today, so that we can see that Medicare is a huge percentage of the government budget, right? Social Security, even bigger. National defense, huge chunk. Now let's go down to things that affect us. Education, oh. Student financial aid, oh. Special education, oh. Right? NASA, despite the millions and billions of dollars, NASA still represents such a small slice of the overall budget. But this allows us to visualize that in order to make policy decisions, in order as voters to be able to make decisions and to say, you know what? Yeah, Social Security is big. It's important. Medicare is big. It's important. Why is the amount that we spend on national defense equal to the amount on Medicare, right? Some people may think that this one needs to be boosted. Some people think this one needs to be boosted, and they have their own reasons why. And this allows us to make those decisions. Languages in the world. So this is just dots on a map. Now, to make this sort of visualization, you need one other dimension of data. You need some sort of geographic data. You need latitude and longitude. And there are a lot of really good Python libraries that help you to take that latitude and longitude data or approximate latitude and longitude and put it on a map. And so we see that there's a high density, and I think this is the coolest part. The highest density of languages in the world, the languages that currently exist, are all centered around, like, you know, the equator, the tropics, right? With a little bit of more profusion in the Pacific United States. And so that suggests that languages, most languages developed and were birthed due to high temperatures, due to, you know, tropical areas, and this also corresponds with, especially in Africa, where we see the most amount of humanity evolving biologically. So this enables us to then compare with an evolutionary map to be able to say, hey, where did humans first arise? Oh, around here, where we also see this tremendous density of native languages. So you can use data visualizations from different domains and compare them. This you should recognize from ESS. This is a very common data visualization of population graphs. We see that this is a demographic transition. That's what this is showing us, going from like stage 2 to stage 3, potentially to stage 4 in the US. This is the baby boomer group. And what we see is that in the future, right, baby boomers are getting older and older and older. And that bump in our demographic transition is leveling out. Good morning, Ayana. We're on the lecture. I really like this one because this is just kind of goofy, right? Film dialogue broken down by gender. So, and this is all in Disney movies, okay? So the blue is male, and what we see here is that 98% of the lines in the Jungle Book were spoken by males. And this is just a bar graph, right? But we do have an axis of different Disney movies. I think this one is just incredible. Frozen, which is a movie about two sisters, still only 43% of the line are spoken. 33% of the lines are spoken by females. still it's dominated by male lines. Inside Out being a more recent movie where females have more than 60% of the lines, and you would hope so, given that like 3 of the major characters are women, 3 major characters are women. And then we have Alice in Wonderland, Maleficent, Sleeping Beauty, but really, really interesting data being represented there. This is selfies. How people, and this includes a whole bunch of different really cool visualizations, like who's taking selfies, younger or older? Well, obviously, more younger people, right? More females are taking selfies than males, some unidentified. What people are doing, are they looking up, are they looking down? Are they looking left or looking to the right? It's fairly even. The tilt, there's no preference left or right, whether eyes are open or closed, whether their mouth is open or closed, whether they're wearing glasses or not, what kind of expression they have. How you arrive at this, I think this is the most fascinating part, is being able to analyze with a computer whether someone is happy, angry, or calm. Because it's not like someone just stood here and, I mean, I have a feeling that maybe this researcher might have actually gone through all 3,200 and coded all of these things. But you can, at this point, write computer programs that can, and yeah, the question is what apps as well. But you can write computer programs, especially in Python, to analyze visually whether someone's face, what direction someone's face is pointed in, whether they're wearing glasses or not, if they're happy, angry, or calm. You can do all of these things and then come up with this data. Now, why you want to come up with this data? Maybe you're working at Instagram and you want to have a new filter that makes people angry, because most of the time they're making a happy selfie. So maybe you don't want a filter that makes them look happy. Maybe you want a filter that makes them look angry because they're more likely to use that one. Maybe you want to make a filter that opens their mouth because most of the time their mouth is closed. Right, the weird apps, change your face, would be a perfect utilization of this data. Also city by city, so you know maybe which fences to make for particular cities, which filters to roll out within those geofences. And again, this is almost a 3D visualization because it's being superimposed on a globe. But this is showing where we will see solar eclipses until the year 2080. A really interesting way of visualizing where the solar eclipses are going to be. And, you know, if you're a travel agency, this is something that you want to pay a lot of attention to. Obviously, you want to slow it down so you can focus on it. But if you are, you know, somewhere in the middle of the country, you're running an Airbnb in the middle of the country, and you're like, hey, we need to have our Airbnb up and running by 2023 because there's going to be a solar eclipse coming through, and we're going to want to charge top dollar when the solar eclipse comes through in the middle of Arkansas or something. So again, there are lots of people who have lots of money who want to be able to visualize data, who want to be able to look at that data and make sense of it. I like this one, daily routines, daily rituals of creative people, famous creative people. The blue shows when they were sleeping. The red shows when they were being creative. The green shows us when they are doing their day job. So you can see someone like Kant, who was a famous philosopher, spent like an hour of his day writing. And when you hover over it, as I'm doing, it shows us what is meant by creative work. So Voltaire, he was working in bed and dictating his thoughts to a secretary at 4 a.m. And you have links to all these so you can explore them. Freud, apparently was writing until 1 in the morning. He'd sleep a little bit, would treat his patients. That was his day job. And then in the afternoon would creatively consult and treat patients. Okay. Tchaikovsky, a famous composer, somehow managed to get away with like 4 hours a day of composing. And that was it. The rest of the time, you know, between composing would just be eating, going on a walk. All of this suggests, when you put it into a visualization like this, all of this suggests, hey, wait a minute. Maybe we need to do more than just be creative in order to actually get those creative juices flowing. Like Kafka was an insurance adjuster, a famous writer, right? And he did his best writing from midnight to 6 in the morning. Like, it's all different for everybody. Really interesting way to look at how people work the best. There's lots of good web visualizations of all sorts of things, and if you're into web design, then this is something to look at becoming a master of, right? So as I'm scrolling down, that's all I'm doing. I'm scrolling down, I'm not clicking on anything. It's showing me this whole lifespan of coffee, where coffee comes from, and all these different visualizations. All I'm doing is scrolling. It's doing all the work, but it's interactive. So it's kind of cool. Like, oh, I see this, I'm interacting with this infographic, and I'm able to stop at any time and focus a little bit more on these steps. So again, I hope that some of what I'm doing is inspiring you to say, oh, I think this could be a really good way to visualize this particular data set that I have, especially if that's what you choose to do in another subject, because you can always use your computer science skills to help your other subjects. I do it all the time. All right. So if you're into movies, if you're into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, then someone spent a lot of time, actually, I think it's 3 authors for this one. Could you do something for this, like this for your computer science IA? Yes, absolutely, you could. You could use visualizations. The focus for your IA needs to be on helping someone else solve a problem in their own student or work life. So it's community focused. And if a visualization helps them do their job better, then 100% that's what you could do. So here's Tony Stark. We can drag him around and we can see his connections. So Iron Man, in case you're unfamiliar, we can see Iron Man's connections to the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And then with a right click, we can kind of like move side to side through this universe. And with the middle wheel, with scrolling inside and out, then we can look through the various depths of the universe. Rappers sorted by unique words used within the first 35,000 lyrics. No judgment here. Jizza, A$AP Rock, RZA, all on the high side of lyrics used within the first 35,000, how many unique words. And then we can see here on the low side, I don't know that any of this is a surprise to anybody, but you know, Wiz is down here. And so this is a way of kind of visualizing, like, oh, I don't know that Lizzo's in here anywhere. This was put together, it was originally published in 2014 and updated in January 2019. I think Lizzo has only been popular since then. So, but this is another way of just visualizing data that you're interested in. And I think that's really the takeaway here, is that there is a way to visualize data that you're interested in no matter who you are or what you're interested in. And even this one has a button for just Wu-Tang. So you can see, the members of the Wu-Tang Clan, what they are actually lyrically involved in. Or you can go down through the list. Yeah, Lizzo's not in here, but for example, Tupac, somewhere in the middle. All right, growth. So again, maps are really helpful if you have data that is based geographically. This is less reliant, this particular map is less reliant on having latitude and longitude. In this map, the data that feeds into creating this map is more based on municipal division. So municipal division being like a city, a province, a state, potentially a district, depending on how each country separates into municipalities. And then you can zoom into this one to get more information, to get even more refined data about particular areas. And this is showing us the growth of particular regions. So we can see that there are certain places that are experiencing negative growth. People are leaving. Other places, and you see Ireland, there's a lot of growth overall in Ireland. And there's less growth in the UK, it's about even. We go to France and we see there's a lot of growth along the west coast of France, along the Atlantic coast of France, where it tends to be, from personal experience, it tends to be nicer and warmer, and you got beachfront property. A lot of people moving into the Madrid area, but not into Madrid itself. So these obviously could be used by governments to make all sorts of high-level decisions and allow folks to say, all right, well, this could be useful for real estate. This could be useful for maybe people who are thinking, oh, I really want to move to a particular area, and I want to move into a happening area. Like, where are other people moving? Where are other people? Where is the best place to move in Europe? And they might go, well, clearly, Berlin. If I'm going to move to Germany, let's go to Berlin. If I'm going to move to Spain, I want to go to Madrid. That's where that's happening there. So this can be used by a variety of different stakeholders. I thought this was fun, the Big Mac Index. So this is comparing currencies based on how much a Big Mac costs in each of the countries. So it's based on what it costs in the US. In Switzerland, apparently, Big Macs cost a whole heck of a lot more than they do in the US. And then in most countries, it's a lot cheaper. This is as of January 2020. This allows us to actually come to conclusions about consumer goods versus what the stock market is saying certain currencies are worth. So we can make potentially smarter decisions about what people are actually paying. Here, this is something to actually bookmark and to keep an eye on. This is a catalog of data visualizations. So this is a way of just kind of keeping in mind all these different types of charts and visualizations that you can use. All right, so we saw this chart with the Crimean War. And it's made up of two pieces. It's made up of bar graphs that are displayed on a circle. So it actually walks you through how you can make these, not from the data perspective, but from the visualization perspective. And this is something that, I don't know about you, but I could get lost in for a while. The dot map, like the dot map we saw of languages. And so this is just a one-to-one, but you could have a one-to-many. questions, things that you're interested in. Would you like to see any of these particular visualizations? Obviously, you can see them on your own. Any of these you're unfamiliar with? ¿Por qué no tienes una pregunta? Yes, and what I was mentioning, Ayana, to Zainab before is that I will develop a project that you guys do where you use Python's data visualization library. I need to walk through it myself and make sure I'm comfortable before I get you guys using it. And I want you to have some experience making something at least simple, straightforward before moving on to one of these other ones. I think a donut chart is actually pretty easy to make. Google Sheets makes donut charts. Has nothing to do with donuts other than the fact that it has a hole in the middle. But these are pretty cool. And this one actually breaks it down to the data itself as to how you would need to separate out the data in order to make the donut chart. Any of these other ones that you want to see in more detail? Do not say word cloud. If you make a word cloud, I might have to like disown you as a student. There are tons of websites that make word clouds. They annoy me more than anything. There are so much better ways. Oh my God. What's a word cloud? That's a word cloud. I know you've seen a word cloud.
Oh, yeah. You just owned me for like a good moment.
They're just like, how is this helpful? Okay, so someone was talking and they said yes a lot.
That'll be good for Mr. Telemundo. He'll just have like a big sigh in the middle.
Yeah, good for a joke. There we go.
Exactly.
And like. I try to stop how many times I say and like, unsuccessfully most of the time. Again, I don't like word clouds. Sure. Sankey diagram. You didn't say that, and I just said, oh. Sankey diagram is really cool. We've seen them in environmental. They're used all the time in science, where they show inputs and outputs. And what's another one that I really want you guys to see? These we use in environmental all the time. And in fact, I'm going to write this down as a note to myself because I think this is a good crossover between environmental and CS, where you get state-by-state data, and then there's Python libraries to really easily map that data and create a visualization where you say, okay, color everything that's 40% and above this color, everything that's between 30 and 39 this color, and it creates that map super quickly. I didn't know they were called Chloroplast Maps. Now I learned something, but these can be really, really helpful to be able to make. If you were going to do an IA using some sort of data visualization, what sort of visualization do you think that you might use? And keep in mind, you don't have to create these necessarily all using code. A lot of these you can make with a combination of Google Sheets and charts, drawing. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with a good old bar chart, right? But if you're going to do a bar chart, spice it up. Yeah, if you're going to do a line graph, there's lots of different ways to do line graphs. I think the point in data visualization, and specifically 2D visualization, which is what we're talking about, 2 dimensions of data, is that we have more than just a simple line graph. All right, we can represent more in the same visualization than just your standard, like, 2 pieces of data. Google Sheets will do this one straight up, the stacked area graph. But this is very much like the first visualization that I showed, where we see that this is a percentage of a whole. And we can see how that percentage of a whole changes over time. So to finish up, so this is all 2-dimensional visualization, if not 3. And I don't want you to think of 3-dimensional visualization as something that has to actually be real and have 3 dimensions like we perceive as 3 dimensions, meaning that there are multiple dimensions of data that you are representing. You are not just representing how births change with time. You might be saying births in a particular region change over time. And so you're doing a multi-dimensional visualization, or a multivariate visualization. And so this is the link that I just showed you, these different ways of doing 2 or more dimensional visualization. And this one computational aspect is important to keep in mind. There is a correlation between the size of the data that you visualize and the amount of memory that is required in order to efficiently process and create it. For example, the first ones, and I know, Ayana, you didn't catch this, but the 185 million tweets in 2014 that were analyzed in this infographic, it takes a lot of computing power in order to be able to sort through 185 million tweets. And if you're making it once, publishing this data in a graphic like this, then you're not worried about that computational time. If, on the other hand, you're doing this live and you're saying, all right, instead of doing this from January to December, let's say, what are the mentions within the last hour, right? And you're making more of a graph that maybe looks like this for just one slice. What are the mentions over the last hour? Well, tweeting wasn't nearly as popular in 2014 as it is now. So we're talking millions upon millions of tweets per minute sometimes, if something huge is going on. And so how do you process potentially 30, 40, 50 million tweets in an hour that are going back and forth in a way that gives people an up-to-date view? Well, you have to be very careful. You have to be very careful when you have any sort of large data set. And especially when you're visualizing something, you're creating graphics, and graphics require more memory. So if you're running this off of like a personal computer, then you can upgrade your hardware, all right? Consider a graphics card. Consider adding more memory. Consider, if you're doing this on the cloud, making sure that you have dedicated space on a server, meaning you're not using a free account to do this. You are paying for $5, $10 a month to make sure that you've got dedicated CPU and memory in order to be able to do this kind of analysis. So it is important to keep this part in mind, especially if you decide to tackle some big data problems within Python. On Replit, it's not going to be happy. There are other things that we can use to handle big data, Replit is limited because it's free, it's online. They're not dedicating a lot of server space to any particular program, so it won't work out so well. But there are other things that we can use in order to make that happen. Any questions? Because we are just about done. We are done.